Hello and welcome to this event on state-level carbon pricing. My name is Sanjay Patnaik. I'm the director on the Center on Regulation Markets at Brookings. This event is jointly with the Brookings Urban Tax Policy Center with my colleague Thornton Matheson, who will lead the panel discussion later on. Carbon pricing is the most effective and most efficient way to achieve greenhouse gas emission reductions, and it has been proliferating all over the world. However, in the United States, we are still lacking a federal carbon price, but we have seen some movement at the state level, especially in California and RGGI in the Northeast. And so today's discussion will really focus on how state-level carbon pricing can potentially help achieve national climate goals and whether this is a viable way to achieve a carbon price that is high enough so that we can make a transition to a low-carbon economy. It is a real pleasure today to introduce multiple experts that will share their insights, starting with our keynote address, Rajinder Sahota, who is the Deputy Executive Officer of the California Air Resources Board, and then the expert panel moderated by my colleague Thornton Matheson with Barry Rabe, Ian Perry, and Jennifer Winter. Thornton will talk in more detail about their backgrounds. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Rajinder. Thank you so much for sharing your insights today and for being here. Please take it away.
Thank you so much for the invitation to join you today. I'm very excited to be able to talk about the California experience with carbon pricing and then maybe share a few thoughts on how it can fit into a federal effort to reduce GHGs. I do have a few slides that I'm going to share to help with the conversation. But yes, very, very excited to be here and also looking forward to the discussion for the panelists afterwards. I'm hoping that everyone can see my slides. Unless I hear otherwise, I will keep going.
Yeah, you're fine.
Great, thank you. So carbon pricing can take many forms, and we've had this question in California multiple times. And twice our legislature has chosen a carbon market over a straight carbon tax. And so I think it's important to remember that there's many ways to introduce carbon pricing into the economy, different points at which you can introduce it. But then there are also some key differences when we think about a market versus a carbon tax. One of the issues that we grappled with was, where do you set a carbon tax? What's the value? In an ETS program and emissions trading system, you let the market find the lowest cost reductions and price it, and then let the market function to find the lowest reductions thereafter. The government isn't involved in setting that tax value. There's also concerns about leakage. No matter what that carbon price is, there needs to be a consideration of, will it now force some entities or some regulated companies to move their production outside of the state, where sure, it looks like you've reduced emissions in the state, but you've just shifted them off of your books elsewhere, or maybe increased them to the atmosphere because of different production requirements. Another question that we had when we were looking at this issue was, how do you stay harmonized for linkage if you have a carbon tax that's set in legislation? Once something's in legislation, it becomes a political discussion and less of a technical or market-driven discussion. And so there were concerns in California really about, how do you maintain some of the linkages that we had, like we had at the time with Ontario and with Quebec. We still have the one with Quebec. Ontario went their own way. But these are the kinds of questions that we grappled with back in 2006, 2007, when we began the program. And then we grappled with them all over again in 2016 and 17, when we thought about, what does carbon pricing look like for this decade, 2021 through 2030? The debate will continue. I've never seen anyone come to a resolution on this. What I know is that here in California, the debate has happened twice under multiple governors, different bodies of the legislature, and both times they settled on a carbon market for that carbon pricing. So I think it's important for me to share what we've seen in California. Our targets were set for 2020, which was to return to 1990 levels. We did that in 2016. And so there's been a good track record of being able to reduce emissions while the population and GDP for the state has grown. And we're very proud of the fact that we hit the emissions target for 2020 in 2016. Our next set of targets is a 40% reduction by 2030. And we have a plan that lays out how to get there, including carbon pricing that was adopted by our board in 2017. In terms of the coverage, this pie chart shows all of the sources that are in our GHG inventory. It's the energy industrial sectors that we have. And 80% of these emissions are covered by the cap and trade program in California. I know that there are programs that cover some sectors and not others, but we felt strongly that if any sector was not included, it was getting a pass in terms of facing the same externality of carbon pricing that the covered sectors would have. So we felt it was very important for us to include transportation, which is the largest sector of GHGs and harmful air pollution in California, and our industrial sources, not just the electricity sector, which we know has been the case in other programs, but we went for all of it. We did phase in transportation, but from the very beginning, we were clear transportation had to be part of the program and had to face the same carbon liability as the other sectors. So carbon markets, carbon pricing is not the only way that we get our reductions. We have multiple programs. You can see that we've had everything from energy efficiency, deployment and standards for clean vehicles, goods movement for freight, renewable electricity procurement requirements, short-lived climate pollutant requirements for landfills and dairies. And then also our low carbon fuel standard program, which is a market-based program in a sense that there's trading that happens with the credits there. And then the cap and trade program, which is all of these sectors except for fugitives, because the other important thing about carbon pricing for us was that we had the ability to accurately quantify with a certain amount of reasonable uncertainty those emissions before we put a price on those emissions. And so to the extent that we could quantify with reasonable assurance and we wanted to have them in the market, we included them. We did not leave any sector out because, again, we wanted to make sure that as many emissions as possible face that carbon cost so that that incentive would be there on all points across the economy to reduce those emissions. The program faced some challenges at the beginning. We had early lawsuits on the program about how the auctions were an illegal tax. We do sell some allowances at 4 quarterly auctions. We had other lawsuits filed the day before the first auction. And then we also had concerns on the offset component of the program, which is a very small part of the program. Offsets account for 4% of the overall program. But a variety of stakeholders, both on the left and right, sued us. We weathered those lawsuits successfully. There was a lot of consternation by the regulated entities and even members of the legislature that a carbon price would cause disruptions. But none of that came to bear with the experiences that we had in California. And I think that's one of the ways that state level carbon pricing is helpful, is that it's a testing ground. It can be a testing ground for any federal design of a program should we get to that point. So that was in 2010. Now in 2017, we have a different story. Our legislature passed a target of at least 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. We had year after year of wildfires. We were exiting a period of drought. It looks like we're entering another period of drought or in the middle of another one. And climate change was on the minds of elected officials and the public. We had some of the most devastating wildfires and loss of life that was in the history of the state around the same time period. We did a scoping plan that showed the trade-offs of using a carbon price through a cap and trade program versus a carbon tax, prescriptive regulations. And industry recognized this time that the state was firm in its commitment, the political commitment to keep pushing on reducing greenhouse gases in the state. And so based on the analyses that we did, this time, instead of suing us, they rallied behind the cap and trade program for all of the benefits that they saw. We had the program running for about 5 years at this point. We had almost 100% compliance. There were no devastating impacts to the energy supply or other disruptions that could be attributed to the program. And in the face of direct regulations or higher carbon tax, everybody rallied around the cap and trade program. And that resulted in a supermajority vote, over 2/3, to make sure that there was a cap and trade program and a role for it from 2021 to 2030. So the political support is very key in all of this. It's not just about the regulated entities. There has to be sustained commitment to make sure that not only do regulated entities understand that there is an unwavering commitment, but then they engage in a meaningful way to try and figure out what is the right path forward on carbon pricing. I do want to touch on climate mitigation and racial equity. We completely agree that any of the actions that we take must protect public health and address opportunity gaps. We have many communities and residents that live in heavily burdened regions of the state due to policies like redlining, and we have ensured that they are the first to benefit from climate action. Our legislature has passed a significant amount of statutory direction related to reinvesting money from the cap and trade program into these communities to help benefit those communities and alleviate some of those health concerns for air pollution and other opportunity gaps. And over 50% of the $19 billion to date is being reinvested to provide those benefits. But the program has not been without its controversy, even on this side. Sorry, let me go back there. There were concerns that the cap and trade program would exacerbate or actually lead to harms in some of these communities. And a recent report by the Office of Health and Hazard Assessment found that that is not the case. While those air quality and air pollution gaps still exist in these communities, the gaps are getting smaller. So there is no evidence that the California cap and trade program is harming communities or is somehow exacerbating the existing disparities that exist. And I think that's important because when it comes to carbon pricing, we know that the environmental justice advocates in California prefer a carbon tax. And in conversations with academics, what I've been able to glean is that the inherent structure of markets is believed to be what has caused the existing disparities to exist. And so markets are just seen as something that is to be distrusted. But a tax is more accessible and straightforward, and that is more trusted in terms of, will there be a direct fee on a company? Will they have to manage it? But again, if a company can buy an allowance or pay for the emission, the behavior under either of these carbon pricing schemes is the same. You're not limited. You just have to be willing to acquire the allowances or offsets or be willing to pay for that per ton under a carbon tax. But again, the whole construct of carbon pricing has been debated, continues to be debated, still not fully accepted by our environmental justice advocates in California, but there is no data that supports that we have actually harmed or exacerbated those disparities. Cap and trade, we have allowance budgets that are issued each year, and I think it's important for me to hit a couple of points here. You can see that we take some allowances out each year for our price containment reserve. The yellow bar is what we give to our industry to minimize for leakage. So they get some amount of allowances to make sure that they are not facing competitive disruptions with production outside of the state or internationally to where they would need to leave the state or shut down operations in the state. And that phases down to less than 50% over this decade. We do give some allowances to our utilities to help to mitigate for ratepayer impacts for energy. And then everything in the blue is what is left over for the state. So we are last in the loading order here. And that what we auction as the state is what generates the revenues that we reinvest in low carbon transportation in our communities and other priorities for the legislature and the administration. But minimizing leakage is something that's in our statute. And the way that we've done it in the cap and trade program is through the free allocation of allowances, which is very similar to other market programs that we've seen out there. Prices are important to consider. We do have a floor in the California program. At the auctions, it goes up by 5% plus inflation each year. So there is an expectation that prices will continue to increase. We saw that we were around the floor for the most of the history of the program. What we see, this big dip here in February 2020, is really the shelter in place. And what we saw was some of the uncertainty and disruption in the other commodities markets manifest itself in our cap and trade program and in our market. And so you did see secondary market prices fall below the floor. And we have a self-ratcheting mechanism that removes allowances if we don't have demand, just as we have mechanisms if prices get too high. But in the recent 12 months or so, we've seen record high prices in the program. There's a recognition that the program doubles in stringency in this decade. There's a recognition that there is going to be continued pushing on greenhouse gas reductions in the state. There's been multiple pieces of legislation that have already been introduced about post-2030 targets. And so there is an opportunity for entities to hedge. The opportunity doesn't always present itself in something like a carbon tax, at least that we've seen. But even with the hedging opportunity, there are position limits so that nobody can exert market power or collect too many allowances to then not have to make reductions later when the prices get significantly higher in the program. Federal interaction. So one of the questions that I wanted to talk about was, how does a state level program get integrated into a federal policy? We saw a great example of that in the Clean Power Plan. That plan allowed for states with carbon pricing to continue as long as they could demonstrate that the reductions for the electricity sector would be commensurate or exceed what was expected in the federal legislation. And I think that acknowledgement and that integration of early action is really important, so that early actors like California, Oregon, Washington, that all have climate legislation and programs now kicking off, that stays. We've seen what happens at the federal level when you change administrations. You get inconsistent market signals. We saw that with the waiver with the automakers and vehicle standards. But when you have states that have this longstanding commitment and aren't subject to the amount of volatility or swinging that you can see at a national level, it's really important to make sure that not only do those states get to move forward with their priorities, but that they're recognized for those in any federal action. A very relevant example is the Canadian carbon tax. When the federal government in Canada came out with a tax there, they very much acknowledged the role that states like Quebec had taken to have a carbon market and allowed for the inclusion of that and recognition of those reductions under their program. And so again, there are models that would continue to support early action by states, and then that action could be leveraged for meeting any national goals. And so there's a mutual beneficial relationship in the federal government's allowing states to move forward, and then once they're ready to move on at federal action, being able to take advantage of those reductions, those experiences on programs, and some of that knowledge base in enacting any federal level policies that would come to fruition. One of the questions that we have is, if there were to be a federal tax or federal carbon market of some kind, what would that mean to the revenues and priorities for the state? I talked earlier about how California has prioritized the reinvestment of our funds back into communities, low carbon transportation, and some of our other programs. If a federal program comes into force and it supersedes or doesn't recognize the state program, those revenues are no longer under our control. Those revenues are going to the federal government for appropriation through that process. And so, of course, we would want to have a conversation and think about how that impacts some of the priorities that we have already established in the state, what it means for some of those investments that we think are critical, not just to meet our climate goals, but to also meet our air quality goals. And then, in the absence of federal action right now, there is no federal carbon pricing program, but there are other ways that the federal government is supporting the state and that we can support the federal government in its NDC targets. The federal government has tax credits and incentives for clean energy, carbon dioxide removal, things like the 45Q credit, and incentives through the infrastructure budget. And those can be leveraged by companies that are working under regulations to reduce emissions in states like California. And to the extent that we're sending the signal, you have a carbon liability, and there's a federal signal, there's a tax break for acting on some of these, those amplify each other and help that transition for the private sector into a more sustainable energy system or sustainable processing system, more than either one of us could do directly with just tax credits or with a carbon market and a carbon pricing program. So we see these as both being complementary. Of course, there's always details in how the interaction happens. I flagged the funding issue because that one comes up the most. But all of the action that happens at the states that get to move ahead early absolutely helps in any targets that are set at the federal level. I think the one thing that we always caution is the action at the states should not be solely relied on, and that the federal level action on carbon pricing in particular should consider how to get at some of the reductions that are very low hanging fruit in some of the states that have not been early to act. And how do you design policies to recognize early actors versus states that are not early actors? Because at the end of the day, as a state regulator, I'm already thinking about the low-hanging fruit being gone in California, but recognizing there's a lot of low-hanging fruit and cheap reductions opportunities across the rest of the US. So these are just a few of the things that I wanted to highlight in this discussion as part of my intervention here, but really excited to see the topic come up. Maybe it's coming up because there's rumors that something would happen at the federal level. I know that we've engaged on some of these discussions with our colleagues at the federal level last year and earlier this year. But I think highlighting that there is early action states, that they do have experience, and any federal action needs to be considered in the context of state priorities is always a good conversation to have. And with that, I'm going to end my presentation and hand it back to Sanjay. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That's super interesting, and I really appreciate your insights. If you don't mind turning off the presentation, then we can do a little Q&A here. And I think I was surprised. It's actually really great that you got so much support in the end for cap and trade. And I feel it's a good sign if both the left and the right sues you. That means you're doing something right, because you cannot make both sides happy. So a couple of questions I had. One is, how does California handle collaborations with other carbon markets around the world? Like, do you exchange information, ideas, experiences, for instance, with the Europeans, which have had a carbon market since 2005, or do you provide assistance to other countries in terms of the expertise that you have built up?
Yeah, that's a great question, because AB 32, our landmark legislation, actually directs us to collaborate with other regions and governments. And that's really in recognition that greenhouse gases aren't a local pollutant, they're a global pollutant. And if California is the only one reducing emissions, we'll still feel the impacts of greenhouse gases and climate change if nobody else does it. And so we have a long history of MOUs and bilateral agreements with other regions. With the EU ETS folks, the Commission, we've had a long-standing agreement with them for information sharing for several years. We also go to forums where it's called the Florence Dialogue, or the EU, where they bring in other countries and other representatives, and we all share our experiences. And what we realize is that as the programs mature, we all seem to see the same issues coming up, the same political concerns, the same technical design concerns. You know, one of the things I highlighted was the price going below the floor in early 2020 because of the pandemic. Well, that happened to all of the markets. And when we regrouped that summer, we all came back together and said, yes, our prices are rebounding, even though we don't have the exact same features in our programs. All of the prices rebounded in similar ways. And so it's interesting to know that it's more about the concepts sometimes, that you're thinking about the concepts than the design of these programs, and sometimes less about, are you aligned on the specific regulatory text or the specific mechanisms? It's the outcomes that really matter, not really the specific details of the program design. Now, where they really matter for program design for California is on linkage, such as with Quebec and with Ontario. And because we had full fungibility of allowances and offsets, we needed to make sure we had the same market rules for all the participants across the programs, because action in one program had the ability to influence the efficiency or efficacy of the other program. And so the kinds of bilateral linkages that we have really do require a very closely coordinated type of interaction. But in terms of information sharing, we've been doing that for over a decade with many, many countries.
Oh, that's really interesting and great to hear. And can you talk a little bit about how is the market dynamics on the carbon market in California? Like how much trading volume is there? Are there liquid markets? Do companies really trade a lot, or do they mostly get the permits at the auction and then be done with it?
There's quite a bit of liquidity, and I think one of the telling points was when we saw the secondary market start to emerge. There's this point as a regulator on a carbon market, and I've had this experience in conversation with some of my colleagues in other programs. When you start your program, there's this anxiety whether or not it's going to be seen and taken seriously as a market program by the private sector or the people that will ultimately have to comply. And when we saw the creation of the secondary market products starting to emerge, and then the secondary market become active, it was a relief in a sense that not only did we project the right political certainty, but the design of the program favored that these products should emerge and that these secondary market trades should be happening. And there is significant liquidity in the program. We report out on that every year from our primary database, but also secondary entity or third parties report on it constantly, that you can sign up for those bulletins. I think the key measure for us is there's been 100% compliance. We have not seen price gouging or market control in the programs. And the prices that we see in the secondary market align with the prices that we see in the primary market at our auctions. And so those are the kinds of tests that we think about in terms of, is the market functioning efficiently, effectively, transparently for price discovery.
That's actually super interesting, which brings me to my next question, which is the price, right? As you mentioned, California has a price floor, which the Europeans didn't have. And in Europe, we saw a big crash in around 2008 of prices. But the price in California still has been relatively low throughout the most of the period, right? Like about $10 to $12 per ton, and now up to almost $28. Has that been actually high enough to induce any changes at companies, any emissions reductions? Where do you see the prices going, and do you think that price is, how to put it best, like high enough to actually have an impact?
So I love this question because it lets me talk about how the carbon pricing program is not the only tool in our toolkit. We have direct regulations on our fuels, technology, electricity sector, all of the sectors under the cap and trade program. And what we did was we looked at a per ton analysis of those policies. They're sitting at $250 a ton in some of those programs, or $200 a ton. So the cap and trade price that we see is not the true price of carbon in the California economy. It has to be stacked on the other prices for the other programs in those sectors. And so if we didn't have programs like the low carbon fuel standard, the renewable portfolio standard for electricity, and we only relied on a cap and trade program, prices would need to be much higher in this program, absolutely. But because we have all of those other programs, they are in fact driving a lot of the reductions, and we are picking up all of the low cost reductions, process efficiencies, et cetera, underneath that. And that's been the case coming into 2021. Now, as we move forward in 2021, as the prices get higher and the cap is much more steeper in its decline, we fully expect the program to perform much differently than it did in the last decade. We know that carbon pricing has been integrated into dispatch models for our energy. So when we need electricity to serve our air conditioners in the afternoon and something needs to be dispatched, it's going to be renewable power over gas power, because gas power carries in the modeling a carbon price now. And so there are decisions that are being incorporated into models and into other policies from the cap and trade program. I think the past decade is not indicative of this decade, just because there's been structural changes made to the program. The only other point I'd make is that, you know, the price in a carbon tax is hard to set because you don't know where to set it, and there's always going to be argument. And the price in the cap and trade program is unique in that it lets the market find the lowest cost and lets the market set that price. And we've seen instances where prices in other carbon taxes in other regions have been suspended or held constant and not allowed to increase because of political concerns. In the California cap and trade program, because it's run through a regulation, through enabling legislation that doesn't have that detail, it's less likely that we would see legislative action or direction to suspend or do something with the program, just because we've added features on a floor and a price ceiling. And so that range is now considered, you know, in some ways, it's an expected range for prices. And in a carbon tax, it's one value, and that 1 point estimate can be subject to what's going on in the energy space or politically at that given moment.
Oh, that's really super interesting, especially the complementarity to your other measures. And that brings me to my last question. What has the response of companies been? You mentioned that actually towards the end, most companies are supporting the cap and trade now. So what's kind of like their stance been? And have you seen specific examples how companies have started reducing emissions in response to some of those policies?
Yes, absolutely. So we have carbon pricing that permeates through electricity and through natural gas prices for our industrial sectors. And so we have seen some of our smaller industrial sector companies looking at alternative technologies to gas combustion for boilers on site. They're signing up for federal and state programs to look at solar thermal technologies to put on site instead of using natural gas. We've also seen some of the large companies developing their own carbon policies and carbon plans for how they're going to reduce. And some companies are even voluntarily retiring offsets for their own corporate sustainability targets. And so there's been this awakening almost in some of the regulated entities in California that carbon pricing, climate change mitigation is here to stay. And so they're being very creative in how they can do that. I think one of the things that we really noticed in the last probably year and a half is the interest in new and emerging technologies and a shift in the fossil industry to not just fighting us, but also thinking about how do we think about the cap and trade program, carbon pricing, and the signal it sends to actually make an argument within our own corporate structure that we need to think about divesting into renewable energy. And so we've heard those conversations. We've gotten analyses from companies that say the signal that you're sending in terms of the carbon price, the signal you're sending in terms of the energy procurement for your utilities is a business opportunity for us now. And this is how we think we can do it. Or they come in and say, if you made some slight tweak to your program, it would make it easier for us to produce this other energy for you. So that has been really encouraging, is that companies and financial officers are integrating the carbon price into where they want to go next. It's not just business as usual, we'll keep producing fossil energy in the state.
I think that is super encouraging. And that's actually how we predict it from the theory side, right? We want companies to have that certainty. And California has now been in place long enough so that they have the certainty, they know it's here to stay, so they can start thinking about alternative ways to do business. This is actually great, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been very enlightening, and I appreciate your time. I know you're super busy. And with that, I will hand it over to Thornton. Thank you, Rajinder, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. So hello, and welcome to the panel discussion portion of today's event on state-level carbon pricing. I'm Thornton Matheson, Senior Fellow at the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center, and your moderator for today's panel. So I'm very excited to introduce our expert panel on multi-tiered carbon pricing systems, who will discuss relevant experience not only in the US, but also Canada and the EU. So first off, Ian Parry is the Principal Environmental Fiscal Policy Expert in the Fiscal Affairs Department of the International Monetary Fund. Ian will be focusing on discussion of relevant aspects of the EU's carbon pricing system. Barry Rabe is the J. Ira and Nikki Harris Family Professor of Public Policy at the University of Michigan's Ford School. Barry will focus on discussing US state-level carbon pricing and political economy. Jennifer Winter is an associate professor in the Department of Economics and School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary in Canada. She'll be focusing on relevant aspect of Canada's carbon pricing system. So to begin, each panelist has prepared some brief opening remarks on their topics. So we'll start closest to home with Barry and then move on to Canada, or Jennifer, and the EU. Ian. So Barry?
Thanks so much, Thornton. Good afternoon. When you consider questions of carbon pricing at the state level, particularly issues of political feasibility and durability, there really are two American stories. We've just heard one of them, California. The other is on the opposite coast, a cluster of states known as RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Now well into its second decade, RGGI has endured all kinds of political shifts and changes in each of its member states. It also has demonstrated some real limits. It remains focused exclusively on the electricity sector, a near decade-long effort to add a transportation component with some parallels to what was just described in California, seemingly has not gone forward, seemingly has collapsed. Unlike California, RGGI has not established formal linkages outside the United States. It's a multi-state mechanism, but those relationships are confined to the region as opposed to the kind of Quebec partnership that California has. Its price has been fairly modest, often below $10 per ton, although that has climbed like other pricing systems, like other trading systems. And in its last quarterly auction, just a short time ago, it went up for the first time to $13.50. There's also partisanship. And one of the things that we see in state carbon pricing policy, state climate policy over the last decade, which was not true in prior decades, is how intensely partisan these divides are generally. And when we look at the 11 states that now comprise RGGI, they are overwhelmingly Democratic Party leaning states. And they are also states that have little, if any, oil and gas production. And so that creates a unique political market that may well be more receptive to carbon pricing and climate policy than other jurisdictions. So that's a unique case. just like California is a unique case. That said, more than 10 years after its launch, RGGI has done some things very, very well. There has been no collapse of membership or reverse diffusion where policies are started and then disappear. In the Midwest, Michigan and a number of other states launched an effort more than a decade ago known as the Midwest Greenhouse Gas Reduction Initiative that was trying to create a multi-state carbon pricing mechanism, and it collapsed within a few years. Even in the case of California, while holding on to that partnership with Quebec, the original Western Climate Initiative involved 7 Western states and 4 provinces. And there has been a kind of a collapse in the ability to create that larger partnership, even though I know California has been trying to find more partners for quite some time. By contrast, RGGI has really endured. It's done some interesting things. It pioneered auctioning, which was not part and parcel of a lot of the early thinking on emissions trading systems, and did it very effectively through relatively transparent quarterly auctions. It has consistently returned revenue to states. Each state participating in this auction gets money that it put in, and then each state can have a conversation about how they are going to use that revenue, usually for energy-related purposes. And it's kind of a model to combine the painful price that makes people uncomfortable with a very politically focused way to think about the benefits with that revenue transfer. In fact, in many respects, RGGI is probably best known in its jurisdictions as the policy that brings money into the state as opposed to imposing that price. It's found a way to build and sustain a constituency. It's contained offsets, their volume and their location, avoiding a potential big Achilles heel that has been a challenge for many trading systems. It also pioneered an ongoing review mechanism to adjust the cap, to begin to consider environmental justice perspectives at a fairly early stage. And finally, I think RGGI shows a kind of ability to be complementary to other programs. Now, there once was a time that the climate policy thinking was that the carbon pricing tool was so powerful, it would just dominate the landscape, and we would move to some kind of a global pricing regime in a relatively short amount of time. That's not political reality in the United States or anywhere else. And when we look at states that have adopted carbon prices, they're also the very states that have been statistically most likely to adopt a lot of other policies, regulatory policies, fuel standards, and the like. And that raises the question of how these policies fit together rather than a world where the price does everything. RGGI region power sector emissions are down by more than 50% since the launch of RGGI. Is all of that attributable to the carbon pricing system? No. RGGI is a player, and the fit has been taken very seriously individually in these jurisdictions, but also collectively. Going forward, where next? We have seen some interesting expansion of RGGI in just the last couple of years. And I think what Virginia was able to do in 2020, putting together a clean electricity standard alongside addition of cap and trade in a former fossil fuel producing state, is a very interesting one. In some cases, following the RGGI playbook, looking at the use of dedicated funds for things that were unique to Virginia, and now opens up the very interesting question when there's a shift in the office of the governorship, and a governor proposes to withdraw from RGGI. This would be Governor Youngkin. Is that a constitutionally acceptable move? And is that a politically acceptable move to take hundreds of millions of dollars that would otherwise be going into, in that case, coastal flood protection and energy efficiency for low-income communities? How does that play out? And just finally, we are beginning to see other states that are beginning to think along these lines, looking at ways possibly to join RGGI and the like. But the reality is that they are overwhelmingly Democratic jurisdictions, or they are jurisdictions where a Democratic governor is up against a Republican legislature and pushing to see how far he or she can go within the limits of their executive power. And that remains this defining divide that we have in so many areas of climate policy. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Barry. And now we'll hear from Jennifer about Canada's carbon pricing structure.
Thanks, Thornton. And I'm going to give you a whirlwind history of Canadian carbon pricing because I think it's important context for the evolution of it and where we are today. But first, I want to mention that Canada is a very decentralized federation. And like the US, the environment is an area of shared jurisdiction between the federal government and the provinces and territories. And this, of course, makes climate policy complicated, particularly pricing policy. So carbon pricing actually started in Canada, in Alberta in 2007 with a performance standard for large industrial emitters. And then in 2008, BC implemented an economy-wide carbon tax. That was followed in 2013 by Quebec's cap and trade system. And then in 2015, Alberta announced it would expand its carbon price to economy-wide plus the large emitter system with some tweaks to it to make it more stringent. And then in 2016, the federal government moved forward with something called the Pan-Canadian Framework, which was a commitment to introduce economy-wide carbon pricing starting at $10 a ton and increasing by $10 a year until $50 in 2022. Now, the Pan-Canadian Framework was signed by and agreed to by 9 of the 10 provinces and 3 territories, and then the federal government. So it was a bit of a watershed moment in moving forward with climate policy in Canada. And then things sort of fell apart. We had government changes in multiple provinces. And as a result of that, many or several provinces reneged on their commitment to the Pan-Canadian Framework. And so what happened is we had a federal government in a position where it had created what was called a federal backstop and a federal benchmark. And so it was basically an equivalency test between the provincial and territorial carbon pricing systems and what the federal government deemed as a minimum standard. So the minimum standard was coverage or pricing equivalent to BC's economy-wide carbon tax. So, and that's a price on combustion of fossil fuels, or equivalent coverage to Quebec's cap and trade system. And provinces had the option of essentially choosing their own adventure and implementing policy as long as it met this benchmark. If provinces did not create a policy that the federal government deemed as sufficiently meeting this benchmark, then the federal backstop would be imposed. And the backstop is a large emitter system, which is a facility performance standard combined with output subsidies, and that's to address competitiveness concerns for emissions intensive and trade exposed industries, roughly equivalent to the free allocation process in Canada's in California's cap and trade system. And then the other part of the federal backstop is an economy-wide tax on fossil fuel combustion. So that's for households and large emitters. So that's the basics of where we are right now. As a result of this, we actually have quite a hodgepodge of systems across Canada. We have some provinces like BC, like Quebec, that have implemented their own systems. So we have both a tax and a cap and trade system. We have provinces like Alberta, where there's a provincial large emitter system, and then the government refuses to implement the tax on households, and so the federal backstop is imposed for that sector of the economy. And the end result is that each province and territory has a different system. And, the benefit of this approach is that there is flexibility for provinces to implement systems that match their specific industrial composition and the political issues, within the province, and a province like Alberta, heavily weighted toward production of oil and gas, competitiveness is a concern. But at the same time, one of the downsides of this approach is that because of the differences across provinces and territories, people are facing the same marginal cost of emissions. And on Friday, that'll go up to $50 Canadian per ton, roughly 40 US. But the average cost per ton is vastly different across provinces. And then on top of that, there's also different coverage. And so all of these differences actually make it more costly on the Canadian economy to reduce emissions relative to a uniform system that was the same across the country. So we're really trading off, gaining some flexibility, but giving up or imposing some potentially unnecessary costs on ourselves. So with that, look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And now we will move to Ian Parry, who will tell us about the very broad and complex system developing in the EU.
Yeah, thanks, Thornton. So emissions from the power and industry sector in the EU are covered by the EU emissions trading system. These sectors account for the huge bulk of the low-cost mitigation opportunities in the EU in the near term. The cap for this sector declines at an annual rate of 2.2% a year, in line with achieving the EU's pledge to cut emissions 55% below 1990 levels by 2030. The emissions price is largely market determined. Currently, it's equivalent to about $90 US per ton, so about 3 times the levels in California. Although there is a market stability reserve, which withdraws allowances from the system when there's a downward pressure on emissions prices. A pure emissions trading system is not compatible with national level policies to reduce emissions in the power and industry sector, in the sense that national policies will not reduce emissions at the EU level if they are fixed by the cap. Instead, they'll just reduce some emissions prices, and effectively there'll be 100% emissions leakage from those countries to other member states in the EU. In contrast, if there was an EU carbon tax, or there was a binding price floor under the EU ETS, then national level policies for power and industry would be more compatible. They would lead to emissions reductions at the EU level without affecting the emissions price. But these instruments, particularly the carbon tax, it's less clear for the price floor. The carbon tax is very difficult in the EU because of unanimity requirements for tax measures as opposed to regulations. A fee-based approach, as at one point was contained in the Build Back Better legislation for the United States for the power sector, would also be compatible with subnational policies. Fee-based apply a sliding scale of fees on firms or generators with above average emissions intensity, and a sliding scale of rebates to firms or generators with below average emissions intensity. As regards the emissions from the building and transportation sectors in the EU, here member states are responsible for cutting those emissions. There are allocated targets which are stronger for higher income member states. But the price responsiveness of emissions for these sectors is much lower than in the power and industry sector, because there's no use of coal in these sectors, and also capital turns over very gradually, at less than 2% a year in the building sector. So for these sectors, it is important to accommodate different policy approaches across countries, given that there's differences in the acceptability of carbon pricing across countries. Nonetheless, it's still the case that 14 EU countries have implemented some form of carbon pricing for the building and transport sector. 13 of them carbon taxes, trading system in Germany. And the emissions prices vary dramatically from below $5 per ton up to $140 per ton in Sweden. But this price variation is less of a concern than for industry, because emissions from the building and transport sectors aren't really very mobile across country borders, whereas they are in the case of industrial emissions. And then just to address competitiveness concerns for industry in the EU, to date, the EU has used free allowance allocations to compensate for these energy-intensive trade-exposed industries. But this mechanism becomes less effective as the EU moves towards deeper decarbonization of the industrial sector, because the free allowances do not compensate firms for their abatement costs. So now the EU is transitioning towards a border carbon adjustment. It's going to apply for iron and steel, aluminium, cement, fertilizers, and imported electricity. A border carbon adjustment is potentially a more robust instrument for preserving international competitiveness as jurisdictions move ahead aggressively with emissions pricing. But they are subject to some legal uncertainty because they haven't been challenged yet at the WTO. One particular concern of border adjustments is that they might impose a disproportionate burden on developing countries, which tend to have higher carbon embodied in their industrial sectors. At least initially, that might be addressed by basing the border adjustment on EU emissions factors for different industries, rather than using country-specific emissions factors in gauging the border adjustment. And then, if the EU moves ahead with this system, on average, it would be collecting about $1 billion in revenue from US exporters. Thank you. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So now we'll move on to the audience Q&A. I had a lot of questions relating to the competitiveness effects of subnational carbon or multi-tiered carbon pricing system. Carbon emissions, of course, generate a global externality. And a carbon pricing is a source-based tax or price that can raise costs for local industries and shift production to areas with low or no carbon prices, so-called carbon leakage. While national governments can use a border carbon adjustment to address these issues, subnational governments, at least in the US, don't have that option. So given those constraints, what are the risks to states who enact carbon pricing relative to neighboring states that don't? And how can they address that? Maybe Jennifer could open the response to this question. And others, when she's done, others should feel free to chime in.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, there are different approaches to addressing competitiveness. One of them is border carbon adjustments, and the other two approaches are like for cap and trade systems would be free allocations of emissions permits. And then in the case of a carbon tax, like what Canada has done and several provinces and the federal government, there's a performance standard on emissions plus an output subsidy. So that's signaling the that output is valuable and that emissions are not valuable. The interesting thing about the combined performance standard and the output subsidy is that it protects those the firms that receive it from import competitiveness. So the relative costs of firms supplying to, say, Alberta, and it also protects them by lowering their cost for their own export competitiveness. So it's two-sided protection relative to border carbon adjustments, which is only protecting the domestic market and making carbon pricing equivalent in the domestic market. It doesn't unless it's combined with an equivalent a decrease in the carbon tax for exporting, and then we're getting into like complicated design questions. And so it's the easiest way for subnational governments to address competitiveness is to in a bad design setting, exempt some sectors because then they're not facing the carbon price. In a good design setting, it's providing those output subsidies so that lowers the average cost of emissions while preserving the marginal signal.
Thank you. Barry or Ian, anything to add to that?
Well, just to add that competitiveness is mainly a concern for the power and industry sectors, not so much for the building and transport sectors. For power, California did introduce the first border carbon adjustment. So there is a charge on imported electricity into the state according to the embodied carbon. So I don't see why other states couldn't follow that for the power sector. And then as Jennifer was saying, for industry, an option is sort of like these tradable emissions intensity standards or equivalently a tax where you return the revenues in output-based rebates, or equivalently, it's sort of like a fee-based scheme where you have emissions you have a sliding scale of taxes on firms with above average emission rates, a sliding scale of subsidies for firms with below average emission rates. So that these schemes promote reductions in the emissions intensity of output, but they don't promote reductions in the level of output, but they do neutralize the first order burden on firms from carbon taxes and help with acceptability.
Great.
I do think in the American federalism case, we see a nation with states that have markedly different pricing, but also more broadly climate policy strategies. And I don't believe that there's solid evidence to suggest that there's significant industry migration in response to those policies, at least the way in which they are set. That said, politically within state legislative debates, these kinds of arguments emerge all the time for any issue related to carbon, or even if we move to something like methane, where state legislatures routinely support some kind of tax, a severance tax on the production of oil and gas. They're relatively popular taxes because the costs are seen to be exported to other jurisdictions where the product is consumed. But every time a state legislature has considered a tax on methane, which is wasted gas and is exempt from the tax, you have an explosive response in places like Bismarck, North Dakota, or Cheyenne, Wyoming. And the argument there is if there were to be some kind of a price or tax applied, then capital would move and the drill rigs would shift. And I think even that is a bit of a stretch of an argument. But when you get into state legislative sessions, that argument does emerge quite a bit and has consistently come up in other places where carbon pricing has surfaced in some way.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. On the other hand, there are the costs imposed by a local carbon price, but there may also be some local benefits from a state or regional carbon price. For example, reduced air pollution. Ian, maybe you could start us off by discussing those benefits and how big an offset are they potentially to the local costs of implementing a carbon price when perhaps neighboring or competing jurisdictions have a lower price?
Yeah, that's right. So these co-benefits, cutting back on the use of fossil fuels, particularly coal and diesel fuel, which can produce significant amounts of local air pollutants, the fine particulates. So in those cases where a lot of the CO2 reduction is coming from reduced use of coal or diesel, you can get quite substantial domestic or local environmental air pollution benefits. And these are often skewed towards low-income neighborhoods. Wealthier people tend to live in areas with a relatively clean air. So at first pass, you would say, well, this is a nice benefit, equitable benefit for low-income households, though it's a bit more complicated when you take into account that it may increase real estate prices in these regions and rents. And if it's landowners who are, if it's landlords who primarily own the properties rather than low-income households, that offsets some of the benefits to low-income households.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? I think the discussion of climate justice is, which of course Rajinder raised as well, is very important. In the U.S., I think there's been significant opposition, or certainly the lack of support for pricing carbon in the climate justice community, because there's a feeling that it does not specifically address the concerns of climate justice communities that have historically been exposed to higher level of pollution.
I could jump in here, and it's like with a slight tangent. And one of the things that's also important in policy design when thinking about carbon pricing is use of the revenue. And one of the interesting things about the Canadian experience is that because we have provinces and territories doing their own thing, there are different choices about the use of revenue. So like, for example, the federal government for those backstop provinces, it uses lump sum rebates to offset the affordability issues with carbon pricing, and it does that through the tax system. British Columbia also provides a rebate through the tax system, but it's means tested. And New Brunswick has chosen to lower personal income tax rates. And so we also have these different approaches to trying to address affordability by using carbon tax revenues. But it really is perhaps not the best way to address the overall affordability issue. As an example, April 1 in Alberta, the federal carbon tax is going to go up $10 a ton. And simultaneously, the government of Alberta has decided to lower its gas tax because of the high price of oil, to like give a brief gas tax holiday. And so that's great for drivers, but doesn't actually address the overall concern of affordability, and doesn't necessarily help people who don't drive cars but are facing affordability challenges. So I think this issue is going to continue to be really important, but it deserves attention separate from just discussions of carbon taxes and emissions pricing policy design.
Great.
And I would only add, I do think that this is a really important issue to consider in the context of, say, Canada or the United States, fairly decentralized federal systems, where climate change, even the acceptance of using that term in political discourse, may vary from one to another. And yet ways in which revenue might be used that would be politically popular could help build some degree of political appeal. In the Reggie case, Virginia deciding to focus on coastal adaptation, flooding, and low-income energy efficiency assistance. That's different than all of the other 10 states in Reggie. But part of that challenge and that opportunity is to think about what those co-benefits might be that are unique and attractive to a particular jurisdiction, as opposed to a more national strategy where the federal government is deciding how all the money is going to be spent.
Wonderful. So just to follow up on the issue of economic constraints on subnational carbon pricing, the two U.S. systems, Carbon Reggie, have recent auction prices of around $29 a ton of CO2 equivalent and $13 per ton, respectively. And although these prices, so they're well below current estimates of the social cost of carbon, which you usually see is somewhere between $60 and $75 a ton. It keeps ratcheting up as global warming progresses. Although the local prices have risen substantially in the past couple of years, but given the previously discussed constraints on subnational carbon prices, I mean, how far can states or regional conglomerations actually go in addressing carbon pricing? this question is for any of the panelists who wish to. Can we get at the subnational level? Can we get all the way to what we see as an efficient carbon price, or are we constrained to stay at a much lower level? And how does this relate to the size of a state economy, and also the coverage, the percentage coverage of their system? California, for example, having a very large economy, it would seem that it would have a lot more capacity to implement such a system than a smaller state.
Well, if I might take a shot at this, I do think that these early state examples are useful models, but there are likely to be real limitations on what the existing set of cap and trade states are able to do. Internally, certainly. There has long been a hope in California and among RGGI states that they could be a model, that other parts of the country would pick up on this. Perhaps nationally, there would be some adoption. And of course, even back in the 111th Congress, way back when in 2009 and 2010, when it looked as if Congress was on the verge of passing cap and trade, California and RGGI were there with ideas, examples, and models, and wanting to take advantage of what Rajinder was mentioning about as being sort of first mover possibilities. We do have a lot of precedent in the US in environmental policy, other areas of policy, for early state adoption to drive the federal level. I think the most recent example that I've seen is the 2020 American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, one of the most significant climate bills Congress has ever passed in the last weeks of the Trump presidency. It passed with bipartisan support, and this is the bill that moves us into compliance with Kigali in terms of HFC transition for coolants. A huge driver there was in 2019, 2020, we had state after state, not just talking about HFC transition policy, but adopting it and moving it. And that, along with some other factors, really created a kind of momentum. We've really not seen that yet in the carbon pricing space. Were we to see states like New Mexico, Colorado, Illinois, Pennsylvania jump on board, that would create a different kind of mechanism, possibly a sort of vertical diffusion, if you will, a tipping point to make this much more acceptable and then take the pressure off those states that now are concerned because they're acting unilaterally. But I'm not sure that we're there yet.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Well, I mean, it's going to be incredibly difficult, even with a federal policy, to achieve these deep emissions reductions that the US has committed to. I think it's a 50% reduction by 2030 below 2005 levels. These are very deep reductions. In the near term, the bulk of the reductions would come from reduced use of coal rather than reduced use of natural gas and oil. So it's important that states where a lot of coal generation is taking place are covered in this pricing system. So that would be difficult enough. I'm not sure of the exact carbon prices that would be needed, but probably well above $100 per ton by 2030. But then if you take out some of the states, particularly those that are using a lot of coal, then it becomes virtually impossible, I think, for a piecemeal state level approach to achieve the nationwide target. So what are the prospects at the nationwide level? Well, I think some dynamic has to change. Most obvious is a change in the composition of Congress, with more Congress, House and Senate members in favor of carbon pricing. But another possible event might be if there was consensus that we needed to radically cut the deficit for financial or other reasons. Then on the table is, well, if you don't do a carbon tax, that means you've got to have a bigger increase in corporate income taxes, or a bigger increase in personal income taxes, or a bigger cut in Social Security, or a bigger cut in Medicare and Medicaid. So none of those options are very acceptable, and it's not clear that a carbon tax is any more difficult than any of those options. So that's one possible scenario where a nationwide carbon tax might be on the table as part of a package to deal with deficit reduction.
Great, thank you. So let's go on to talk a bit about how state level regimes, carbon pricing regimes, can be integrated with a federal policy. We had a question, which I'm going to put to Barry first. Does a state-by-state approach to carbon pricing propel or set back prospects of national action?
The short answer is yes to both. Both are possible. Both have precedent. My own thought, though, is that the states that have taken early action remain in a very interesting position to propel, to try to move things forward. They've experimented with this. They've been relatively successful in doing it administratively. They do indeed create, in almost the historic parlance, models or laboratories that the federal government might develop, much as we saw, as I mentioned a moment ago, in the hydrofluorocarbons, the HFC policy case. That really, though, does become a tough sell when you have the deep partisan cleavages and even some of the challenges in the federal legislative branch, Ian, that you were referring to just a moment ago, that probably are not going away anytime soon. But again, there's abundant precedent and opportunities for this sort of thing. I do tend to think that along with the bigger pieces and challenges, part of the dynamic here that could be really attractive is thinking what a revenue allocation or a revenue return scheme might be. States like getting money. So do Canadian provinces. So does everyone. It doesn't mitigate the pain of a price, but it can potentially be done in fairly effective ways and might contribute to that propelling versus repelling framing that you were mentioning, Thornton.
Great.
I think, I would say, like, I think the Canadian experience echoes that a little bit. We obviously have a little bit easier because there's 10 provinces and 3 territories rather than 50 states. So the coordination problem is a little bit less. But what was, I think, interesting about carbon pricing development in Canada is we had in 2016, we had the 4 major provincial economies, so BC, Alberta, Quebec, and Ontario, moving forward with emissions pricing, and a federal government that wanted to do it as well. And so it was really, the stars were aligned, it worked well. And then, there were political changes. And so carbon pricing has been like really a divisive political issue in Canada as well. It's in terms of federal provincial relations, and even with differences in federal parties. The other part of it is we had the Supreme Court say that, yes, the federal government can do this. And so it's sort of like, end of story, you have to adjust. And so these difficult provinces, now they've lost control over part of the revenue through, because it's these backstop provinces that are not imposing their own carbon price. It's the federal government that chooses what to do with the revenue. And so that is really an incentive for provinces to figure out a system that is equivalent to the federal benchmark, but that gives them control over revenue. And then the added benefit is that they can just blame the federal government for the carbon tax. Right.
Great. So Jennifer, we had a question that I'd like to direct to you first. How can states join existing carbon markets in other states or countries? And do the schemes have to be identical to join? We've seen some cross-border partnering between Canada and California, and I'm not sure whether Washington State is considering entering that. I believe they're going to be setting up a system next year. I'm not sure if they're planning on tying themselves to the existing Canadian and Californian system.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are 2, fundamental concerns there. One is, are states going to implement a tax or a cap and trade system? And so if it's a cap and trade system, one easy option is just join with the California Quebec system, and it's already in place. The rules are set. Another option would be to try and link up with the EU ETS, slightly more complicated, but I think possible. What is going to be particularly interesting is if states decide they want to go the route of a carbon price, so the tax itself, then what price are they matching? Is it going to be like Canada's carbon price? Is it going to be the EU ETS price? Is it going to be the Quebec California cap and trade system? All of these systems have different prices, and when you're pinning your price rate to, say, a cap and trade system, but you're implementing a tax, that means you're losing the price certainty, and you're also not gaining the flexibility of the permit trading system embedded in a cap and trade system. So it is complicated for states to figure out where and how to match. In many ways, the easiest thing to do is just decide that they're going to implement a tax, pick a price, and keep an eye on what other jurisdictions are doing, and to think about any sort of increasing stringency of that price.
And totally agree. It is a super complicated issue. But one other piece that I also think is intriguing is this question of what a carbon border adjustment process likely to be led and introduced by the European Union in coming months would mean for the American federal system, or indeed the Canadian federal system. I would assume with the rather robust carbon pricing regime in Canada, Canada would be certainly covered under a carbon border adjustment. But then when I think of Quebec, it has a carbon pricing partner known as California. Would carbon border adjustments be applied uniformly across the US, or would there be a California carve-out? Would there be a RGGI carve-out? If carbon border adjustments really were to be applied and kicked in, would suddenly there be an epiphany in a great many state capitals? Let's get on board. That's really, really hard to know. Here, I would only say if you look at discussions in state capitals 2 or 3 years ago, the phrase carbon border adjustment was not known or was seen as some academic concept. Now it's real. Now there are all kinds of questions about this relationship between a kind of trade tariff relationship and whether or not it would be good to get in line with a carbon pricing regime, if for no other reason than to avoid possible tariffs from other jurisdictions. And that's new territory.
Right. Right. And in the US, we recently had a proposal, it was not enacted, but for a border carbon adjustment based on regulatory factors, but clearly the US has no coherent carbon price at the time. But this, I believe this proposal came up in response to the prospect of both Canada and the EU having a substantial carbon price under which US exports would be disadvantaged.
Yeah, I don't think that makes much sense. I mean, the point of the border adjustment is to charge for the taxes or allowance purchase requirements on the emissions that are remaining in your industries if they're not subject to those charges. To the extent that the US uses regulations instead, well, those are reflected in the emission factors, the emissions rate for US industries. And so if the EU was assessing the border adjustment, that would be taken into account when it's looking at what's the emissions intensity of US industries. So I don't think there's any legal basis for exempting the US for using regulations. On the one hand, if the EU, even China, when they extend their trading system to the industry sector at some point in the next few years, maybe they'll introduce a border adjustment as well. So on the one hand, does that create a strong incentive for the US to then price emissions? Well, on the one hand, Not really, because only 2% of US carbon emissions are embodied in its exports. And as we said, with the EU carbon border adjustment, they'd only be collecting $1 billion in revenue from US exporters. It's a modest amount, but not a very big amount. But on the other hand, maybe there's a lot of stigma attached. Maybe if Canada, China, and the EU are all saying we're not accepting industrial products from the US without a border adjustment because you don't have carbon pricing, maybe the stigma attached to that might galvanize that action. Who knows?
Thank you. This next question is for Barry first. So if federal level carbon pricing is not politically feasible, which it does not at present appear to be, are there any administrative steps that the federal government can take to facilitate state level carbon pricing, the spread of the current system?
I think this is a difficult path, in part because we have a history of using the Clean Air Act of 1990 and trying to reinterpret it for carbon. If you think of almost the entire Obama climate record after the collapse of legislative discussions in 2009, its last 6 years were principally focused on interpretations of existing statute. That ran into legal issues. It ran into a succeeding administration that was hostile to all these provisions, including something called the Clean Power Plan, which had this unique effort to try to create a 50-state negotiation with the EPA, giving them a number of options to try to reach power sector reduction targets, but in effect, leaning toward a cap and trade system of some sort with lots of incentives for states. There was tremendous pushback to that, but to sort of reinvent that mechanism primarily through the Clean Air Act is a challenging one. Legal issues, changes in the court, and also uncertainty about the extent to which the current party in power will hold the presidency for multiple terms consecutively, as opposed to the kind of ping pong game we see when there's changes in the executive branch. So I wouldn't rule that out, but yet we've seen, and this is true in a great many states, executive only made policy at the federal level and state level on climate tends not to be very durable, runs into lots and lots of issues. And it's one of the reasons why I was reluctant even to mention states like Pennsylvania and North Carolina, which are looking for ways to get into RGGI, but basically by bypassing the legislative branch entirely. I have some real questions about how viable that actually is over time.
Right. This next question is for Ian. Rajinder discussed California's choice between carbon tax and cap and trade. And of course, they went for cap and trade, and RGGI is also a cap and trade system. Thinking about pricing carbon at the subnational level, what do you see as the major pros and cons of the two different systems?
It's more of a degree because either instrument can incorporate design features that make it behave more like the other instrument. So I think, as we've heard, certainty over emissions prices is very helpful for creating the right environment for upfront investments in clean technologies that have long-run payoffs. So that's a potential advantage of a tax, that you can specify a trajectory of emissions prices over time. People know, and as in Canada, where there's a very clear trajectory of how the minimum price requirement will rise over time. But under a trading system, as in California, you can have price stability provisions like a price floor. In principle, you could have a price ceiling as well. I think there, I'm not sure, but I think there is one in California, $65 a ton at the moment or something. But by these price collars, you can narrow the uncertainty. So that's not necessarily a huge drawback of trading systems. Carbon taxes are very simple administratively. I mean, all states have fuel taxes in place. All we're talking about is integrating carbon charges into those, applying them to other fossil fuel supply. natural gas, other oil products, and coal. So administratively, it's very straightforward. Trading systems are a bit more complex because you need new capacity to monitor emissions downstream. You need to monitor trading markets, but that's not a big deal for an advanced country like the US. It would be for a country with that limited institutional capacity. We think, that there's ideally you want to exploit the fiscal opportunities. So maybe that's a little bit more likely under a carbon tax if the revenues are accruing to the finance ministries, and they can be put towards cutting other taxes. Maybe it's a little bit more convoluted under a trading system if the environmental agency is monitoring that, and to have the revenues. And the restrictions in California, I think, on how the revenues can be used, they can't be used to cut other taxes. So maybe that limits some of the fiscal opportunities a bit. But it's all a matter of degree. You can design a trading system to mimic a lot of the advantages of a carbon tax.
I have to jump in here. I think the biggest both pro and con of a tax is its transparency, in that people know that there is a tax, and that is, part of the political discussion in Canada, and I bet in the US is like it's characterized as a charge on everything. It doesn't work. It like all of these sort of absurd myths that people don't respond to incentives. And then on the other hand, systems like a cap and trade system, it's there's opacity, and the charge is on generally large industrial emitters. And so the politicians can conveniently ignore the issue of pass-through and say, we're not hurting families and things like that. So the transparency of a tax versus a cap and trade system is, it lends itself to, I think, more resistance.
Right. So we have about 5 minutes left, and we've had quite a few audience questions on sort of the political economy and the outlook for state level carbon pricing or federal carbon pricing in the US. And the most of the questions revolve around the current oil price spike, and the effect that has had with some states rescinding their gas tax temporarily, even states that are pro-carbon pricing, such as Maryland. And looking a bit further down the road to the 2022 elections, how could those possibly affect the evolution of carbon pricing in the U.S.? And then, we do have other states coming into the equation, such as Washington. So I guess just to finish up, a tour de table of how people see the current situation and how they expect it to evolve over the coming months. Perhaps Barry, we'll start with you, our political economist.
Thanks. I don't see much prospect that the 2022 elections are going to deliver a more climate-friendly Congress or a more climate-friendly set of governors and state legislatures, with a few possible exceptions. That said, there are really some interesting developments to weigh and think about, one of which is we are navigating the 117th Congress that was thought to be one of historic future achievement in climate by using non-carbon pricing tools, the Clean Electricity Performance Standard, the Build Back Better provisions. These have run into some huge political challenges, and we might emerge after this 2-year period with little, if any, substantial new engagement. That will open again the question of how we do significant decarbonization, may be a path back to pricing, particularly in those states that we're expecting through the Build Back Better proposals to be receiving tens of billions or hundreds of billions of dollars over an extended period to support energy transition and other kinds of programs. That money is going to have to come from somewhere, and states may have to raise more of it on their own than they thought. So there's some possible ways to begin to think about that, especially, and last point, if the carbon border adjustment kicks in. It's not the way one would like a nice, thoughtful, orderly conversation. And yet, I do think if that moves forward in more and more states, you may see a greater receptivity to trying to head that off in some way, protect state interests, and move forward in that way. It's hard to forecast that one.
So you're referring to the Canadian and the EU border adjustments? Exactly.
If that external pressure comes through a trade negotiation of some sort with the US, I think this point that I was raising earlier about carbon border adjustments meets federalism will become a very real issue, with California asking, why shouldn't we be treated differently than Texas? And on.
Briefly, Jennifer or Ian?
I think my only comment is, globally, we're iterating slowly towards more and more countries introducing some form of carbon pricing. And that's going to have pressure on the US and individual states. In particular, border carbon adjustments weren't really a thing in Canada until the EU announced it. And so there's definitely, we shouldn't discount the role of external pressure and the decisions by other economies on decision making within North America.
Well, I think in principle, this is an absolutely fantastic time to phase in and lock in carbon pricing with extensive coverage and deep carbon prices as international energy prices start to recede from their peak levels, without an increase in energy prices relative to what we've just recently experienced. I think, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I think coal prices are maybe 300% higher than they have been 18 months ago. Gas prices are like 10 times as high. Oil prices, what are they, 2-3 times as high? So, the sorts of carbon prices that would be needed to generate those enormous increases in energy prices are huge. So we could be locking in $75 per ton carbon prices as prices recede, but without raising energy prices relative to recent levels. So that really is a golden opportunity to lock it in. But I have my doubts whether that will actually occur in practice, and we'll squander this opportunity, I'm afraid.
I absolutely agree with you. Of course, there's been, the political reaction to these oil prices in particular has been shock and horror, and how can we bring them back down? From my perspective, it's not a bug, it's a feature. This does create a tremendous opportunity. We've been forced to transition to higher energy prices. We can coast on that by, as the markets loosen up, introduce some pricing to keep things more level. But that is all the time that we have today. And I wanted to thank all the panelists for a really great conversation, and Sanjay and Rajinder as well.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.